I hope Labour and the Greens can do so also.
Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. That was an interesting call from the Minister. Towards the end of his speech, he called on Labour and the Greens to support the legislation in order to demonstrate our support for migrant workers and our desire to prevent their exploitation and to prosecute those employers that do exploit those migrant workers. And he said that we should support the legislation simply because they say it does what they say it does, because they say that it will achieve those things, to prevent exploitation and to prosecute the exploiters. Doesn't matter whether we think it actually achieves those outcomes or not. Don't worry about the details. That's what the Minister says. Don't actually look at what the legislation does. Doesn't matter if the opposition parties actually considered it in detail at the Select Committee, listened to what the submitters had to say, listened to what a lot of migrant worker representatives had to say when they came to Select Committee and said this legislation will not work. No, don't worry about that, says the Minister. Just vote for it because it'll look good. That is this National Party's way of doing things, actually. Smoke and mirrors. Pass legislation that has the right title, has the right purpose clause, but actually when you look at the detail, doesn't do any of the things they say it's going to do. Well, sir, we do not support that approach. We will not support this government's window dressing. Sure, we supported this legislation to Select Committee because we agree. We do have a problem in this country of migrant workers being exploited. And the Minister is absolutely right that there are a number of places around the country that are extremely reliant on migrant workers. Christchurch, the rebuild, is utterly reliant on migrant workers, and we thank those migrant workers for coming over to New Zealand and supporting the rebuild. Of course, the fact that we are so reliant on migrant workers is because this government failed to provide the training and the skill development that New Zealanders needed to be able to participate in the rebuild. We've got loads of New Zealanders still sitting on the unemployment benefit because this government failed to invest in education and skills development. So yes, we are reliant on those excellent migrant workers who are coming over here and helping us get the job done, but we needn't be. We needn't have all those migrants coming and doing that work. We could have New Zealanders doing that work. In Queenstown, the government has now introduced an exemption so that Queenstown hospitality employers don't have to go through a labour market check to make sure that there aren't New Zealanders who could go and work in Queenstown. They can just bring migrants directly in. Well, sir, the reason why the Queenstown hospitality sector is struggling to get... The reason why the Queenstown hospitality sector is struggling to recruit and retain workers is because of the pay and conditions that they offer. If they're having trouble recruiting and retaining staff, then this government should encourage them to improve their pay and improve the conditions and improve the accommodation that they provide for those workers. That's why we're so reliant on those migrant workers, and that's why this government has actually created the conditions in which more migrant workers are likely to be exploited. And that's why it needs to be seen to be doing something with this legislation, even though the submitters who came to the Select Committee told the Select Committee that it wouldn't work. Sir, the Minister mentioned migrant workers who come here on temporary visas, who are entitled to work in New Zealand, and said that this legislation would protect them. Well, sir, in fact, I know, Mr Speaker, you know very well that there is a group of workers who come to New Zealand on temporary visas who this legislation will do absolutely nothing for. And that is the group of workers who are employed by foreign companies to come and work in New Zealand. Sir, there are workers, as you know, sir, in your electorate at the hut workshop.
Order.
Yes.
I think even though the member knows I have some interest in this area, it's not appropriate inappropriate to bring me into the debate while I'm the chair.
That is true, sir, and I apologise. Sir, there are workers at the Hut workshop who worked in New Zealand for 6 months. That's what I'm told. They worked in New Zealand for 6 months, and yet the Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety insists that they do not need to be covered by New Zealand employment law. So they don't get the right to the minimum wage. They don't get the right to sick leave. They don't get the right to bereavement leave. They don't get the right to annual leave. They don't get the right to be covered by health and safety law. They don't get the right to be covered by the Employment Relations Act. And that minister is comfortable with that, and they won't be covered by this legislation either. That minister over there is absolutely comfortable with workers coming to New Zealand, working in this country, and not being subject to the minimum standards, not being protected by the minimum standards that New Zealand law provides for. Sir, that is an outrage. That is an absolute outrage that that government is prepared to allow those workers to be potentially exploited by their employer. Are they being exploited? We don't know, because those workers were not prepared to tell, Mr McKelvey says go and ask them. Well, Mr McKelvey, you obviously haven't been paying attention, because a Labour inspector did go and ask them, and for whatever reason, those workers refused to tell the Labour inspector what their wages are. And the minister triumphantly said in the House yesterday that that was absolutely the right thing to do, to tell the Labour inspector to butt out, because that was a private matter between those workers and their employer. Well, if those workers were covered by New Zealand employment law, that would be a matter for the Labour inspector, because under the Minimum Wage Act, sir, the Labour inspector is absolutely entitled to ask for information relating to the wages those workers receive. And I think, sir, that actually that legislation should apply. It should be possible for the Labour inspector to find out if those workers working in New Zealand are receiving the basic minimum requirements that any other worker in New Zealand should be allowed to receive. It's a wonder that a Labour inspector even got in there in the first place, because we have so few Labour inspectors and we have so many examples of the minimum requirements that are expected under New Zealand employment legislation being absolutely flouted by employers. Because there are so few Labour inspectors, it's highly unlikely that they'll get caught doing it, sir. So this legislation won't make a jot of difference to those most extraordinarily vulnerable migrant workers. Even if it did the job it was supposed to do, even if we felt we could support it, that minister believes that because it is New Zealand employment law and New Zealand immigration law, it does not apply to those vulnerable migrant workers, sir, and that is an absolute outrage. Actually, the minister covered the reasons why we are opposed to this legislation. We do believe that actually the powers of search and surveillance that are going to be given to immigration officers will actually act as a disincentive for migrants to come forward and report unreasonable exploitative practices by their employers. We also agree with the Legislation Advisory Committee's concerns that the proposed immigration levy is too broad and in fact actually acts as a tax, and that would have been an easy matter to tidy up, but this government refused to do that. So we actually think that the result of this legislation will not be to make migrant workers feel more secure in the workplace, will not be to encourage them to speak up and alert the authorities to exploitative behaviour, but will actually, in fact, do the exact opposite and make those workers more vulnerable. So it's all very well for the minister to say that if Labour wants to look like it is supporting migrant workers, it would vote for this legislation. Sir, we are not simply interested in looking like we support migrant workers. We are interested in really supporting migrant workers, and that means all migrant workers, whether they are employed by New Zealand companies, New Zealand individuals or foreign companies. They should all get the same protections, and we should be working hard to enhance those protections, not diminish them in the way that that minister and this government continues to do.
Jonathan Young.
Thank you.